could you give me your name and job title, please?
My name is Taha Hashim, and I am the features editor at wisdom.com.
I love it. Uh, let's start with. I think we're both aware here that I'm not Asian, um, but weirdly enough, when I moved into cricket, or when I moved to the UK and into cricket, I think being an outsider meant that I probably shook up some interesting things. And um, one of the more interesting things that happened quite early on in my career was I was given a story that I didn't quite know how to frame, and partly it was because it was 2000 and I don't remember, it must have been 2008 or 2009 of uh, when a bunch of players were talking to me about Adil Rashid, and they kept saying he had the wrong attitude, and I kept looking at his numbers and going, "This doesn't quite make any sense, right?" And I think at that stage, I'm trying to remember the full details, but I think he was dropped in 2009, slightly after he was player of the match. I think he was the best player for England in one game in an ODI they lost against Australia. And then a couple of games later, he was out of the side. And it didn't really make a lot of sense that he was suddenly no longer in the side. And so naturally, I started asking around. I was told he had the wrong attitude. And my thought for that at the time was, are they trying to tell me he's Asian? And I couldn't quite get my head around it because I'd only just moved over and, the politics of all that. And I remember talking to someone very senior who's not particularly involved in cricket, but has been involved with cricket, who's an Asian person. And he looked me dead in the eye and said, there's no racism against Asian people in UK. Then Taha, I played a lot of club cricket and realized that there was masses of racism against Asian cricket. Have you, or Asian cricketers, I should say, have you personally had those kinds of issues where you've just been like, the thing that they have said is very coded, but it's very obvious what they are saying to you?
Um, I think it's one of those things where you don't realize at the time, and then I think you will kind of days will pass, months will pass, and then you'll think about something said, and you'll be like, that didn't sound like what was that about? That kind of thing. Uh, that person probably shouldn't have said that. It's that kind of thing. I think. I think yeah, I've definitely had those kinds of experiences. I've never had. I think it's very few occasions in my life where I've had kind of like direct kind of racial abuse, but they're definitely sort of little moments that you look back on, and you can't really go back and tell someone, oh, why did you say that? That kind
Yeah.
of thing. But you kind of think in your head, what did that person actually mean there when they said that thing?
So the thing for me is because the Adil Rashid was all about attitude, and what they were trying to say. I mean, it was very obviously framed to me in that way, but also over the years, that's been the big thing is quite often the attitude, the training, sometimes fitness, and these various things that they've talked about. I remember having a very big argument with a cricket coach once who said, surprisingly white English cricket coach who said, "We've done everything we can. We've bent over backwards for Asian cricketers, and they still don't come through the system." And then we had a big conversation about it, and at the end, he was like, "Ah, now I get it." And he was basically saying what he had done is he'd set it up in the exact same way that he thought he had to set it up for, well, essentially white English players, but also Southern African players who both fit that model perfectly. He didn't really understand that younger Asian players were coming through with different educational needs, like as far as the parents and the pressures they were put on, different holidays. Like he didn't understand that there were certain there was there might be a week of the year where they couldn't come, all those sorts of things that and that is almost at the heart of where we're going to go to with this piece is that or this podcast is that more often than not the actual system itself is flawed in that the people who are running it don't understand the needs of this huge community in the UK. And you and I both know that if you play club cricket, Asian cricketers are everywhere in the UK, and then you get to the professional level, they're not there. Is that something you've heard from a lot of Asian players coming through? Of there's like a lack of understanding of the sorts of needs and that they need to be looked after with, and it's not that they want to be trained softer or it's just that they need someone to understand that they're coming at it, especially when they're young, from a completely different world.
Yeah, and I think I think that it's natural for people to kind of come into a new environment and you don't really want to be treated differently, but there are always going to be from your background, there are always going to be certain things that need to be taken into account. So like in the while I was kind of working on this piece that we're going to talk about, like hearing kind of stories about and this is stories that I've kind of read about before as well, where you'll have kind of Muslim kids come into a setup, and coaches might not realize that they're fasting because it's Ramadan, that
Mm.
type of thing, and coaches not being able to kind of understand that, and these players might be even kind of not explaining it themselves, but things like that, and yeah, it's in the kind of the context of working on this piece, I think I just got an understanding of um yeah, what one of the key things was, I think players will come into a setup and they they don't really want to be treated differently, but there are certain differences, and coaches themselves will, you know, fail to clock those differences and just assume that everyone needs to be treated the same, but that's really just not the case.
Yeah, I think in general, like, it doesn't really matter what workforce you're in. That if everyone who is a coach has come from a similar kind of background, and that that they will probably use what worked for them, which will be the exact same thing. If you then have other people come in with different needs, it's like the coaches need to be trained, and it's all well and good to go. There aren't enough Asian coaches in English professional cricket, which I'm sure we'll come to later on. That's fair. But if the coaches also aren't being trained, even if they are of there's different kinds of Asian backgrounds, right? It's not this monolith anyway. You still need to be trained, and most coaches are given this job because they are former players, they're professionals, and they're very good at running nets, right? That's a
Mm.
big difference from suddenly understanding the cultural differences. I'm very interested. You obviously broke the Azim Rafiq story way back when. It feels like 100 years ago now. Has that changed and you're of Asian heritage, but you're obviously, in the UK. Has that changed your career and your thinking around these sorts of stories as well? Because beforehand, my guess is, and I base this on all writers, you probably would have thought of things very much from I did this and I came here and I do this. And then as as the Azam Rafiq thing breaks open and you start to talk to more probably players of, Asian ethnicity and maybe even players who've moved over to the UK from Asia, I would think that you would then start to think about things a lot differently than even you had previously.
Yeah, I think, um, but I think I can assume that players. I came in. I came into that Azim Rafiq story kind of with almost a sort of pre-based assumption that if you're an Asian player and you've come through that system, you probably have experienced something that wasn't right. I just had that
Mm,
sense just because of looking at the numbers, basically, right? Like just the lack of Asian players, and I just assumed that something wasn't right to kind of begin with. That being said, I was still obviously taken aback when I kind of spoke to him, and he talked to me about his experiences, and I have sort of been continued to be taken aback by kind of the responses of kind of English cricket towards everything that's come out, and the kind of, I guess, the kind of lack of action, and the kind of, I guess there's almost like you almost feel like there's this movement where people are just like, kind of don't really want to deal with this. It was kind of like better when it was kind of something that just wasn't talked about, and we could kind of just turn away from it, that type of thing. Um, so in a way, I don't think I've actually changed that much in terms of how I think about it in the last couple of years. I've still slightly kind of been taken aback by things, and kind of the Rafiq story in general, and how it's kind of kind of where it's got to. But I think I was kind of always slightly pragmatic about things and like realize that there probably is an issue here before the Rafik thing. I think that's what led to me asking him about it. Um, if I didn't think there was an issue, maybe I just wouldn't have asked about whether he'd experienced anything. I think I asked him with the full knowledge that probably, especially coming through Yorkshire, which historically is an incredibly exclusionary county, where for the longest time to be born within Yorkshire's borders to play for it, and the fact that there is such a large, there are so many, um, people from Asian backgrounds within that county, and if you look at the numbers of players that were coming through that Yorkshire system, I mean that just wasn't right. So I definitely assumed that there was probably an issue there.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is, I think in what's happened with Rafik is people have gone Yorkshire racist bad, right? Which is a very good opening gambit. But the problem within this isn't that. It isn't that, that a few players have been treated racist. It's that the entire system has not been set up to make sure that these players are filtering through the system correctly. The racism is like the really bad, scary end, but
Mm.
all the things that have happened along the way, it doesn't really matter if it's racism or if it's not racism at a certain point. If the players aren't playing, there is a structural issue within the core of it. And as someone who has played cricket in London, you play against so many really good Asian players, and then you have a look at Surrey's team and you have a look at Middlesex's team, and you can't help but think there's something not right here. That something is not completely transferring over. And then, of course, in 2018, the ECB released a report that uh, South Asian heritage players made up 30% of recreational cricketers in England, and it was 4% of players at the professional level. That's in 2018, this is before Azim Rafiq. They didn't need Azim Rafiq. They had the numbers in front of them. There was an obvious problem here, and there's an obvious problem in, I don't know if you would say the pipeline or something else, something to do with the professional game. It doesn't really make any sense, does it? Once you hear that number, there's nothing that you can do to be like, that is perfectly acceptable. Of course, that's a natural attrition rate, right? So when you heard that number back in the day, what did you think?
Well, that stat is so. What's kind of fascinating me about that stat is that you're right in saying it came out 2018, but it only started like, I feel like it only really started gaining traction after the Rafik story.
Mm,
It was kind of like matter of fact. All right, 30% South Asian players, right? Just handful at professional level, and the South Asian Action Plan comes up, and it's like, oh great, these people kind of do something about it. And then for like 2 years, it's kind of like, whatever, it's fine. Like, I just didn't really hear much about it. And then the Rafik story happens, and then that stat, you know, does the rounds. But yeah, I mean, that totally just adds up from, like you say, you play cricket in London, you can kind of see it around you, right? There are just so many Asian players at a recreational level. And then it's just fascinating when you get to a professional level, and you look at the counties, and it's, it's, people aren't wrong. It's just, it's white, you know, private, privately educated guys. It doesn't add up. And it's only kind of, and I just hear that statistic so much, like all the time now, with kind of 30%. And it'd be interested to know how much that number has changed now.
mm.
But I very much doubt it's changed significantly in terms of the players at the professional level.
And so someone else who heard that stat and then decided to do something about it was a man named Tom Brown. Can you take me through his background?
Yeah, so Tom um, is someone who, I think he played a bit of age group cricket at Warwickshire. He ended up becoming a performance coach in their pathway system in 2017. And the following year, he kind of begins PhD research at Birmingham City University, and he investigates investigates this issue, the lack of British Asian players at professional level. And initially, what he told me was that initially during his research, the question that was going around in his head was, what's the Asian community doing wrong? And as he does more and more research, he begins to understand, actually, you know what, we might be the ones going wrong here, in terms of, the system essentially. And he kind of realized it's kind of this. He talks about this subjective nature of talent ID and development, and coaches not being able to understand cultural differences of players, and basically, essentially, Asian players are being let down. And for example, with the cultural differences, one example he gave me was, um, he said it himself. Within Asian culture, there's a different way of showing respect, a different way of communicating, and what you get with kind of all these coaches are within the system who are primarily white. They'll be looking for westernized ideologies. They want people to challenge them, and I guess, yeah, what he talks about is kind of an ownership of development, but like players challenging the coaches more. Whereas in Asian cultures, that's there's a different way of showing respect, basically. And he talks about how these kind of things, I guess, eventually factor into selection when it really shouldn't. And
Mm.
you talk about that Rashid. You talked about Adil Rashid there, and kind of just looking at the results themselves, and just that being enough, right? If someone's taking wickets, scoring runs, that should be enough. You should be based on how good you are at cricket. And I think Tom kind of pointed out that this is what was going wrong, and beyond looking at that in his research, he also looked at the numbers, and it's the numbers that kind of really like ram home the issue here. And I think that the number he found that is pretty much quite remarkable, really, is that if you're white, British, and educated from a private school, you're 34 times more likely to make it as a pro than if you're British, Asian, and from a state school. So, look, there are issues of race there, but there are also issues of class, and that's kind of the combination that English cricket strikes with.
Yeah, it's excellent that he went off and found an even more horrifying number than the one that that was started with. I mean, I remember when I played cricket in Australia, and we didn't have, I think, the same percentage of Asian players around us. But I played with a lot of very good young Asian players, and the majority of them, their parents held them back from the pathway. As in, I had a friend of mine who had a chance of playing representative cricket, and his parents were like, "Well, no, you have to go to church." And another one he couldn't train twice a week like the rest of us because his parents said that second day was for learning another language, and all those sorts of things. And I remember Lisa Sthalekar saying a very similar thing when she looked at her Asian friends as she came up through that system. There are already hurdles there, right? And then you go to the other thing. What I found interesting in the stuff that Tom was looking up at is that's not just about Asian kids at a certain point. That's like they're looking for alphas who are going to, stand up to their coaches. And it's like, so what? All the shy kids who are good at cricket don't come through the system. It's such a warped way of thinking about it. And it reminds me of the whole Nathan Horrocks situation years ago when they were playing that test at the Oval in 2009. And they said, what do you think, Nath? Do you want to go out there? And he's like, yeah, well, if you pick me, I'll go out there and I'll bowl. And they were like, no, you want to go out there and you want to destroy them, and you're going to rip this ball. And he's like, well, no, if you select me for Australia, I will play that sort of. And they didn't pick him because they said he didn't have the attitude they were looking for. It's such a and that's what I found in my time in professional cricket in the UK, covering it, is that there is this sort of almost monolith of, you got to be that guy. And it's like, well, that's not how cricket skills work. Cricket skills actually come into various different personality things, and then you put in all the cultural stuff. So Tom works all this out, right? The interesting thing is what he does next, because usually that would be published and it would become the next step that people like you and me would use. But in fact, he kind of gets inspired by that and takes it to another level.
Yeah, I mean, he could quite easily just publish an academic paper and kind of moved on with his life. But I think he actually wanted to do something about it. He kind of found an issue It was very obvious, and he was like, something needs to be done about it. I think the key thing for him was, something might be done about it, but it might take a very long time. The problem now is that there are players out there, South Asian players, who are not just kids, they're adults now that are kind of, if they don't get the chance in the next few years, that's it. Their careers are gone basically.
Mm.
And so what he does is he plays club cricket in Birmingham. He's a very accomplished club cricketer, and he ends up playing in the same team as Kabir Ali. Kabir Ali, cousin of Moeen, played a test for England, played quite a few one-day internationals back in the kind of early noughties. And he gets talking with Kabir, and uh, essentially that's where this idea forms. The idea for it's something that Tom pitches to Kabir. It's to form a South Asian cricket academy, and academy being in the sense that no, not focused on kids coming through a pathway system, not like that. It's finding players who are 18 and over, essentially been rejected by the system. Guys who might have played county age group cricket, guys who even played for England on the 19s, but are now kind of out there, still trying to make it, but struggling essentially. And so that idea gets formed in 2020. What happens then afterwards is that to make this happen, you need a bit of money. And so Tom, I think for most of 2021, they're looking for sort of kind of money out there, and if there is any. And it's only kind of at the end of that year that they get approved funding from Birmingham City University, which is where Tom did his PhD research. And so yeah, that's where things get up and running, and on a kind of shoestring budget, essentially about close to £50,000. They form this academy, and essentially it's all about, it's kind of, I don't know, I kind of imagine it from a scene from like The Expendables, where you're like trying to recruit, I don't know, like get a whole team together, that kind of thing. And he basically starts building a squad of kind of South Asian players. They have like an open application process, but I think there are already kind of names out there that are being picked out. And this is the summer this year is where they start playing against county second 11s, and the whole academy is formed basically where there's a clear kind of pathway where you get these guys playing against county second 11s. County second 11s get impressed by them. County second 11s take these players. They get trials, and then eventually the hope is that they get professional contracts.
There's so much to unpack there. One of the interesting things is, you may not be old enough when the unicorns played in English cricket. Do you remember that?
Kind of vaguely, yeah.
Yeah, so they basically had like a bunch of players who weren't playing professional cricket in the county structure. They gave them a team to play in the Pro 40. I think it was the Pro 40. And like straight away you realize, there's a lot of really good players out here that haven't, have slipped out and don't know anyone, or something happened, or they had a form slump and no one wanted them, or an injury or whatever. It's like, you could do this with almost any group. But what I found was more interesting here is that he didn't go the most obvious thing, which is probably 16 to 19-year-olds. And he basically said, I'm going to prove it in the most dramatic way possible. I'm going to find the people who have already been shunned by the system. And they get really good really early on, don't they? And so, I mean, the players themselves, they get to a point where what are we in August now? Probably by July, he's struggling to get a team because half of his best players have already then been picked up by counties, right? Like, it's that quick that this starts to happen.
Yeah. So I went in kind of late June to watch them play against Surrey Twos. And Tom explained to me that like he'd kind of he's like missing like 11 players essentially, because like either a few guys may be injured, but quite a few guys are like trialing elsewhere, or they had one guy, Kashif Ali, who's already got kind of a professional contract essentially. And so there's like this constant churn of players. It's like they'll play 1 week to the next and there'll be just like a completely different set of players coming through, because things are moving so quickly where county second 11 coaches are on the phone to Tom asking, can I get this player down, that player down? And it's just, that's kind of just a sign of how well some of these players are playing against these county second 11s, how well some of them are trialing for these county second 11s. And so I think initially I first spoke to him in May, and as we kind of would continue chatting over the months, you could kind of sense that things were like really moving. Essentially, that constantly players were coming through, getting chances, impressing, and yeah, it's just like he. I don't think he expected to find as many players as he's found, essentially, but it's kind of just there are just so many guys out there who are just like clearly good enough to like at the very least, play well in County Two's games.
And what did you think about it? Did you think that it was he found these players and it gave them a professional environment that was easier for them to develop their skills? Or do you think that actually all those players were kind of out there already, and now that they were all playing in a team together, it was harder to ignore them? Like, what's is there is I mean, obviously it's probably a mix of both, but what was your sense having talked to him and having been down there?
Well, I think because of the speed of how quickly some of these guys have like got professional contracts, I think there's a case that there are players already out there that were just good enough. And essentially, I think what the best thing about this whole thing is that it's cutting out a lot of faff for players to be like trying to find counties on
The
their own,
network.
essentially. Yeah, it's like they don't have to do that themselves. Look, you come here, you play for that team, you just focus on your cricket, and then, essentially you're trialing in front of counties. You're not having to like sort out and write to a county and be like, can I get this chance? Can I get this? You've got a team. That's fine. Like you can come here, you can play here this week, you can play next week. You'll keep getting those chances, and a county will kind of just will see you. You don't have to like market yourself, essentially. And
Because
so I
that
think there is that. I think sorry.
No, I was just going to say, because that tells you a lot about English county cricket, which you and I probably already know, which is that the player development system is horrendous. They are not going out there trying to find the best players. I've had friends who watch minor county games and just send phone numbers of players to teams, and teams never even call them. So that shows you, just before you even get to the Asian problem, that they're not even out there looking for these players, right? I mean,
Yeah,
it shouldn't be on a young, let's say a 22-year-old player who may have played for England under 19s, as you said. It shouldn't be on them to make the right phone call to get the game, because they're not going to know all the people that they need to know, right? I mean, it tells you that the entire system of English county cricket and the way they get talent is completely fucked up.
yeah. And it's also, I think one of the things about this is it's I feel like in English cricket, if you get to a certain age, you're kind of just like, okay, that's it. Like, you cut them off, right? That kind of thing. And it's like players can kind of actually get better with age. And like so there's there's not that kind of realization, I think, at points. And so what's kind of good about this as well, it's like, you'll have like 24, 25-year-olds who have kind of like, they've like done the rounds at these county second 11s, and like they've become better players, and it's kind of giving them the chance to actually show, what, I'm better than when I was kind of released by your academy, that type of thing as well.
Yeah, so that whole thing for me is just, it is so bizarre, because I would never have done it the way that Tom did it. I would have done it the way that Ebony Rainsford Brent has done it with the young West Indian players, which is, the young black players in England, not just those of West Indian backgrounds. But I would have gone out and I would have been like, okay, who are the best 16 to 19-year-olds that we can find, and let's develop them. Whereas he's actually proved that the players are there and they're not even picking them, and it's a remarkable way. I find it incredible, and I know that he's already looking at doing the same thing with women's cricket as well. So there's going to be a bunch of women's players in the 100 that he'll probably find in the next little while. Just a couple of stories of some of the players. Tell me about Amit Basra.
So Amrit was kind of, so he's batter, bowls a bit seam. He came through like he was through the Northamptonshire age groups, basically. Basically got in there when he was about 10 years old, was there for essentially 10 years. Gets to the point where he's playing second team cricket. But last year he was, he basically got told that he wasn't getting a contract essentially. And I think in the past that would have left players. I mean, for him as well, he was kind of like, what happens next essentially? Because if you're getting released, you're 19. It's kind of like that's kind of it, right? You
Yeah.
kind of what do you do next essentially? And so for him, the timing was perfect that he gets released, and then a few months later, essentially, Saka gets its funding. And so what he got from that was basically a place over the winter where he could train. They were training in Birmingham. I think it was kind of like an hour and a half drive for him, but he was kind of making the drive. And essentially, he gets access to high quality coaches. Kashif Ali was coaching during that winter. Jim Troughton was there as well. Tom himself as a coach. They've got Shaftab Khalid, who used to play for Worcestershire, as a coach as well. And so you get all this training, and he was just like to me, it just brought structure to his winter, and like a kind of almost basically an elite kind of coaching environment, essentially. And so he trains over the winter, um, gets gets a game with Kent twos, and kind of on his debut against Essex, against a pretty strong Essex attack as well, actually, I think. Scores like 157 of, I don't know, not that many balls, basically. So he's, I think he's still, I'm not sure, but I think he's still kind of playing a bit with Kent twos. I know for a fact that when I went to watch Saka play against Surrey twos, he was playing with Kent as well. So he's kind of one of those examples of where Saka just came at the kind of perfect time, because there are guys out there in that Saka set who are a lot older as well. But he's kind of the perfect one where it's kind of he got released and straight away he got into this system.
Is it Savin Pereira? I feel like that. Yeah. So tell me about his story.
I knew nothing about him, and I turned up to watch Saka play, and he's kind of batting, he's opening the batting. And like kind of it's one of those instant things where you're kind of watching this guy, it's like, wow, he's really good. Kind of like short, left-handed, just very classy to watch. Scores this 100. And while we're watching, Tom's explaining to me how like this guy basically, he got released by Middlesex. Tom didn't actually say this to me at the time, but I later found out, he played for England on the 19s, played in like the same team as Tom, like opened the batting with Tom Banton in a side captained by Harry Brook. And those two guys have done pretty all right for themselves. And that he basically, like, a friend of his had messaged Saka's Twitter account in April and said, I've got a friend who used to play for England on the 19s. Would you be interested in kind of like helping him out, basically? And so this was like Savin's. So the game against Surrey was Savin's second for Saka. The first had been the previous week against Northamptonshire in Red Bull game, where he scores like a 70 odd and 90 odd to help Saka win their first ever game. So instantly, it's just clear that this guy can play. And yeah, I think it's actually, I think, a bit of a shame. I think Tom told me a few weeks ago that he'd actually, having done pretty well, as in, so even after that Surrey game, he goes and plays for Glamorgan twos and scores 100 in his first innings there. But after that, I think he broke his finger or something like that a few weeks later or something like that. So that's just very, very unfortunate. But another guy who just quite clearly can play it and has a great sort of like CV behind him, essentially, like play England on the 19s. That's a pretty big deal. And so he can quite clearly, just like it was just a very obvious thing watching him, like, oh, this guy's very good.
And the other one I thought was really interesting was Kashif Ali, who played in the Kashmir Premier League recently, but hadn't played in county cricket since 2018. So he's a guy who from England who's gone off to play professional cricket outside of England, but no one at home paid him any attention.
Yeah, he's fascinating in that I think he's born and raised in Pakistan, kind of moved over here when he was probably I don't know, probably 10, 12 years ago. Like, if you go on his cricket archive, it's fascinating. He has played for so many county twos sides. He's played club cricket all over the country. This is one of those guys who is done basically everything he could
Mm.
to try and make it. Um, but I guess the kind of the way you can say that Saka's been a success is that this guy had spent so many years doing this, making runs everywhere, making, like you said, making runs in the Kashmir Premier League, and then within a few months, he's he's got a professional contract, having started with Saka, and so essentially what happened there was he plays in a game for Saka against Worcestershire, uh, scores a pretty scores a pretty rapid 50. Worcestershire see him. They take him on trial. He just can't stop scoring runs in the twos. Gets a short-term professional contract till the end of the season. Plays blast cricket. Makes his first class debut. Scores a half century. Uh, Pretty much immediately gets a 2-year deal. And so it's kind of just like it's such an obvious there's like you could see the how like the path works basically with Saka through him, and it's like all those years of like going from this county twos to this county twos, this club side to this club side, to then kind of just almost instantly just you know being a professional cricketer. It's like just the perfect success story.
I mean, it just tells you the inefficiency of the system, of the way that this is all going, and as we've said, he tried to do it the right way, and it still didn't work. And it does say something. I think what they've managed to do is incredible. The one thing I would say is that again, an ECB report in 2018, it's probably the same report, but I did check your article, said that less than 5% of coaches of first class cricket were South Asian. I would say that if you take away the spin bowling consultants, I'd like to know what number that gets to. I find it incredible in English cricket how often the spin bowling coaches happen to be from South Asia, and they have no ability to coach anything else other than spin bowling. So that is something that Tom is not looking at, but that is really that's the should be the ECB's main priority at the moment, is how do we get coaches in of different kinds of backgrounds.
Yeah, I think that they are kind of so they are they do have coaches of Asian backgrounds. So they've got Shaftab Khalil involved, who is was a spin bowler. Owe Shah's involved. Obviously, Kabir Ali was you know co-founded it, and was kind of their director of cricket. So I think there is the aim to kind of also give chances to Asian coaches. But yeah, you're right. It doesn't really just work if you just look at the players. It's kind of things have to kind of change from you know top down essentially. Um, it's beyond coaches, also administrators. It's just at all kind of levels, like representation kind of needs to improve. I think one of the things that was kind of became very apparent with the kind of Azim Rafiq story was the fact that he just hadn't had kind of support from coaches who were Asian. There weren't Asian coaches there to
Mm.
kind of understand the kind of like we talked about the kind of cultural differences. He's from a Muslim background. It's a different thing, right? To what the background of a white player, the experiences of a white player, and yeah, I mean, you're right. That stat is from that exact same report. So it's all kind of interlinked, and you should understand that representation has to improve at all levels. Um, and yeah, this. It feels like it's almost easier to address the playing part. Um,
Mm.
like what Tom's done, it's very direct action, and you can do that from a playing perspective, but how you do that from a coaching perspective is also kind of interesting. And kind of what I found kind of frustrating about the ECB South Asian Action Plan is that it came out 4 years ago. And if there are things that are improving, it'd be good if the ECB kind of shared that. But I don't think they really have. So I don't really know what the numbers are now because they had all these plans to you know, increase the number of coaches and, you know, give Asian coaches all these opportunities. But like how do we see that? I don't really know.
Well, I mean, it's really interesting that I think we know that the three main issues have been what happened to black cricketers in England, right, and black coaches specifically as well. There actually should be more black coaches, being that the previous generation had more black cricketers, and that also hasn't happened. And you've got Ebony Rainsford Brent kind of out there, doing her thing in Surrey. The other thing is working class cricketers seem to be disappearing, no matter their ethnicity, right across England. Freddie Flintoff is doing a documentary and trying to, stumble his way through that. And then you've got Kimber Ali and Tom Brown doing the South Asian cricket. No, was it South Asian Cricket Academy? There's too many Sakas in the sport, man. There's the South Australian Cricket Association. There's the South African Cricketers Association. I just think Tom and Kabir need to come up with something better for me personally. But it does feel like the ECB had just like, they'll do a report and they'll mention that there's a problem, but the actual action seems to be being done by everyone on the outside. And I mean, talk about it's all well and good being shamed by these people. And when I first heard of this thing, I thought, oh, okay, some business in Birmingham has probably put in, a big chunk of money, and, or they got a sponsor or something or whatever. And then I read your article, and they've done all this on £50,000.
Yeah.
That's less than a professional contract in county cricket, right? That's what's that? Your fifth best seamers contract in a county team? Yeah. I mean, talk about shaming the ECB. They have Tom Brown and Kabir Ali are taking the piss here. That they're basically turning these blokes that were on they're on the scrap heap into professional cricketers in front of their eyes within weeks of signing them up magically. And nothing's being done. I mean, that it's got to be the biggest slap in the face to the ECB that you could ever have.
It's ridiculous. Like, it's just it's nuts. And like, the ECB haven't contributed any funding to this to date, and it's just like, I guess it kind of just like it kind of just shows kind of how it just shows them up, right? It's just like you commissioned all this, like, this massive report. You could have just, I don't know, like, forked out a few quid, started out something like this, and like with the funds that the ECB have, they could have, it could be on a whole different level. Like, the numbers would be incredible, the amount of players they could do if they brought something direct into this. I think the thing is, like, kind of with the ECB, and I almost feel like it's almost like bogged down by like bureaucracy, right? Like, for an organization like that, it's just like it's incapable of. It just feels like they think they're probably incapable of doing something like that so direct. Like, everything has to have like sort of like everything has to be, I don't know, more structurally sound or something. Whereas this is just like two guys who had an idea, like, just got a bit of money and just kind of like just went with it, like, just like, all right, let's just get some players, let's get some fixtures going, that kind of thing, right? And like, didn't overthink it, just like went direct change. And yeah, it's just totally showed up the ECB. And I mean, it'd be, imagine if they did pour a bit of money into it. It would be, like, Tom himself said, like he's basically the issue he's had is that he's got like this. They're training in Birmingham during the winter, that kind of thing. And there are players from like all over the country who are getting in touch. They've got like players who've come from Scotland who are playing, that kind of thing. And imagine if you were able to open 3 or 4 more academies that could run through the winter across the country, and you could have more teams during the summer, essentially. Like, the numbers that would come through, the players that are there. I mean, right now he's got the issue where he's got a team of 11 that he can quite easily fill out, but then there's like 40 other guys out there who could also quite easily get a game and have a chance of getting a professional contract. And so the money is kind of limiting what they can achieve right now. And even with such limited money, they're achieving a lot. They're doing more than what's been done by the ECB, essentially. So yeah, I mean, what they've done on very little money is pretty extraordinary, to be honest.
Yeah, well, reading your article, one of my thoughts was, I wonder how much they spent on the report that Tom
Yeah,
Brown
exactly.
saw, that has basically changed everything. Because I'm guessing it's more than £50,000, and he's managed to actually, do this. And this is, again, I think what he's done is brilliant. Has really shown up the system. But again, these are the players who are already existing. What can happen? What could happen with the generation out there? And
Mm.
this, I also think this is something that probably can be scaled across to all those other problems that can help, what Eben is trying to do, what Freddie has recently, started talking about. There is a huge talent problem within the way that players end up playing in county cricket. And your best chance of playing in county cricket is at a young age getting into a private school. That might be on scholarship, but it might actually just be that your family has a lot of money. And then through that, you filter into and you seem to have a huge advantage over everyone else. And it's like, if I was trying to run an international cricket team, I'd probably want as many people from as varied backgrounds as possible coming in. But the whole thing is remarkable. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking about this story. And I'm sure I'll get you on again sometime.
Cheers. Thanks for having me, Jared.